are you guys feeling? You guys okay? Are you happy to be here? Okay, give yourself a round of applause because you guys look lovely. So, a bit about the Center for Social Justice Initiatives. It was previously known as Toro's Pride Foundation. It was incorporated in 2020 and later became the registered charity in 2021. Their work centers around working with survivors of gender based violence in Canada and is run by survivors of gender based violence. Their mission is to work and address, prevent, and end all forms of gender based violence because this is an abuse of human rights and the after effects of abuse are tremendous. Their vision is a world free of all forms of gender based violence so that everyone can enjoy their basic human right of living a dignified and safe life. What are their core values? Trauma informed, survivor centric, culturally safe and relevant supports, gender based analysis and diversity lens to leverage inclusion, equity, and intersectionality, gender equality, and anti oppressive approach. Now, you guys need to give a round of applause for that. That is amazing, the core values that they have as a group. So, without further ado, because I am not here to speak to you about climate change, I'm just like you guys, I'm here to learn about climate change. So, our first speaker for today is Paul Stevers. He's the president of Think Renewables Group and Integrated Climate Tech and co founder of Climate Solutions Advancement Network. Paul Stevers is a serial clean tech and social entrepreneur, a Canadian engineer and inventor. After selling his stake in a medical waste technology company, he founded a non-for-profit called Charity Help International to support children in Afghanistan and in Africa. In 2020, he founded Think Renewables Inc. in the US to develop a series of computer-related products that are designed to operate in challenging environments, such as Afghanistan and parts of Africa. Then in 2014, he founded Think Renewables Group to help coordinate the operations of his various companies, further develop the group's technologies and services. And then in most recent, in 2022, he founded Integrated Climate Tech, which integrates complementary technologies to maximize climate impact in a profitable way. So without further ado, please give a warm round of applause for Mr. Paul Stevers.
So thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Is there some people here that are actually originally from Nigeria or their family is from Nigeria? Is that anybody here? Or not at this point? So different parts of Africa. Okay. It was estimated that Nigeria needs $166 billion in climate action between now and 2030. Now, they don't have that money, but they also don't really have the capacity to put all the proposals together and get projects happening on a big scale. So we were invited to submit 4 different proposals last December to the Nigerian government. And with working with the different people we had, only one of them is almost ready to submit. So as of right now, nothing was submitted. So this got me so alarmed over this spring that there's such a lack of capacity to do professional quality proposals that there needs to be a real effort to do that, to work together and get this done. And another thing that I didn't mention in here is that there's quite a bit of capacity being added through artificial intelligence. There's fundraising AI is a software thing where it can help you write your first draft of your proposal. And that's something that I'm quite keen on. I don't know if you guys have ever tried ChatGPT and Google's Bard. It's quite capable with what it can do. Now, it's not perfect, but it can sort of help you create your initial content. And what I actually proposed to the UN was that we work with a service that becomes knowledgeable about all these different climate solutions. And so you can just pick your location, put a few things in about yourself, and it'll go and produce a proposal for you about a particular solution that you're interested in, which could be biochar, which could be agroforestry, could be cactus farming, whatever you find useful. So is there any questions come to mind that you would like to talk about?
Thank you very much, Paul, for the wonderful presentation. It's not a question, I think it's a contribution. And I want to highlight on what you said about specifically Nigeria and lack of capacity.
Yeah.
I worked in Nigeria in 2016 with Global First Canada through Kuzo International. And I was working on a project that gave funding to young people in the agri-sector and also build capacity of those individuals and also connect them to funding institutions, in this case, the banking institution. So what we're doing is that we identify Nigerian students, because part of your presentation happens to do with writers, with the knowledge of preparing proposals and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so what we did, the focus of the project is to first identify students, graduate students who were serving, because in Nigeria, once you complete university, you have to serve for 1 year. If you fail to do that, you cannot hold any public position. So they call it the National Youth Service Corps.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Yeah.
That's
so
a pretty
part
good
of
system.
my work, yeah. So part of my work is to go to what they call the orientation camp. So the various states, they place you in different states. So we were working in Cross River State, Calabar, the capital. So I go to orientation camps, and then through our network, we recruit maybe 15 to 20 corpers to work on our program. So they go to, we build their capacity, and then they go to the various communities, and then they help to identify young youth who are into agriculture, and then they help them to write these proposals that, again, they send it to the banks. So we give them the seed money, because the banks will tell them, okay, you don't have any collateral, you don't have any experience with us. How do we give you money? How do we ensure that you're going to pay back?
That's right.
So instead of even getting them to go individually, we got them to form cooperatives.
Yeah.
So with a cooperative, they have leadership and all that. So let's say 15 in each corporate based on the local AGA that they come from.
Yeah.
And then they go to the banks and say, look, Kuzo International gave us, through the Canadian government, gave us $500 each, or let's say $1,005 each. This is what we're able to do with it. Now we need some loan from the bank.
Yeah.
So I facilitated that process, and then through that, even the interest rate had to come down. And even that, at a point in time, the banking institutions were now encouraging more of them to do what? To apply through our program. So the whole idea of capacity, I think the capacity is there, right? What identify in Nigeria, which is very prevalent in other African countries, is the various red tapes and the bureaucracies.
Yeah.
You know, what is it there for me?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if you had that experience. And if you had, don't be shy to share with us, because those are the roadblocks.
Yeah.
The funding will come because you were making some staggering figures, 700 million from the World Bank. But the question is, where does the money go with respect to the implementation of the programs?
That's right.
So the capacity is there. But the question is, what are you giving us?
Yeah.
For me, even you helping me, what are you giving me so that I can be able to work on a project that is going to benefit me? And those are some of the issues that we identify. So I want to highlight on that the capacity is there.
Yeah.
Okay. But the issue is that maybe you might want to explain that to us.
Well,
better.
okay. So I'm working with a very ambitious Nigerian on this cactus project, okay? And he's familiar with how things can go wrong in Nigeria. So before he submits it to certain agencies, he needs to have a deal with them. He needs to have an understanding, because he says that if he just submits it blindly, somebody is going to copy it, and then somebody else will get the money, and he won't get it. Right? So he has a certain understanding of how that works. So that's another one, is if you do a project in Africa, I certainly recommend that you work with a local knowledgeable person who understands how the system can work in that country. And that it should have proper registration, so whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, but you need to have a system and to know that you're going to have a successful result. Okay, but remember, there's a lot of money that is coming available in various channels, whether it's the World Bank or the like Acumen and other organizations. So there's a quite a bit to go after, because the needs are urgent. One thing I saw a headline that in Nigeria, that just in the next few months, they're expecting 29 million people to be food with an acute shortage of food, as in basically people starving. Okay, so the conditions in getting pretty tough. Now this can create conflict and mass migration. So the Europeans and others are quite interested to provide enough money to stabilize. So I do believe that a lot more money is going to be coming available. Okay, but you need to be wise and smart, and like what Kwame is talking about, is be wise about how you actually implement. Okay, you don't want the money just going into some bureaucrat's pocket, right? You have to do this the right way. So a lot on the go. There's another thing that I should mention is that upcoming is a conference this September that's in Ottawa. That's basically a Nigerian-Canadian conference, and I'm going to be presenting this as well with enhancements that I'm going to be talking about. So there's things that are going down in sequence. And the other thing that I was thinking is that I've been in regular communication with the University of Development Studies in Ghana. And the one thing that I would like to end up with is that if there's some people here interested in working on a project, that we do it with them to apply for funding that would end up to be implementation or demonstration implementation in Ghana at the University of Development Studies. And it would be, we would also have a training program. Now, the one thing that's certainly going to be high priority for me is that the students will have access to content like that. So at the server, like at their, where they're working, they would have access to all this educational content via hotspot. So any other questions come to mind? Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Rajan. I'm from Cambodia, one country in the global south, and a country is one of the countries most affected by climate change. And it's also a country with wide gender inequality as well. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation about the climate funding. My question is that besides climate funding, what can the developed countries do to support globally in terms of climate change mitigation besides climate funding?
Well
and how already the developed countries are?
Yeah, well, to me, one of the things that let's say in Cambodia, I understand it's many difficult situations there, and that what's needed is to be looking at solutions that mitigate carbon emissions. Okay, like for example, with biochar, you can grow more food in the soil with that, but in addition, you get paid for it. So this group called Biochar Life, they're actually operating in that region, and they can actually pay local farmers to take their waste crop, turn it into biochar, put it in their soil, and they'll pay them like in the range of around $90 a ton of CO2 sequestered, and a ton of biochar is 3 tons of CO2. So it's around $270 a ton what they'll pay the farmer to put that in their soil. And then the farmer has the benefit for many years. In fact, when you put biochar in your soil, it benefits you next year, but a lot of organics grow around there, and in fact, it works better. It even has a bigger impact in the 3rd and 4th year, right? So that it has that it's quite something with what it can do. And then there's also other things like, for example, agroforestry, where you have agricultural and you have forestry mixed in, and that seems to create quite a bit of benefit with that. So certainly, if you look at the 28 climate solutions by Drawdown Lift, it's overwhelming amount of information. So you can, decide which ones you want to pursue, and go with the ones that you think are the lowest hanging fruit for yourself and for the community that you're working with. So there's many options about what could be done. And once you've got a solution and you've got something that's very compelling, then you go after the funding so you can implement, right? Does that make sense to you? Does that answer your question?
That makes sense, but my question is about from the perspective of the developed countries, the donor like Canada, what can they do more in order to mitigate climate change?
What can
besides
Canada do more?
climate funding, yes.
But what can Canada do more? Well, Canada has some funding for developing countries, but from my feeling, it has to scale up massively. Is that the amount of money that the developed countries are offering to provide to the developed is not nearly enough, right? And so one of the things that I want to do in discussing with the Nigerian government is that they need to share this information with other countries, and then when it comes to COP28, they're actually talking about this, saying, we're going nowhere here. We've got a food crisis, we've got this, we need much more funding. And another thing that I should mention is that there's a group of big corporations like Coca-Cola, Microsoft, others, and they have collective sales of around $14 trillion. And those companies are committed to net zero. In order to get to net zero, they have to purchase carbon credits from somebody, okay? So developing countries can be creating carbon credits, meaning that you're putting carbon in the soil, you are earning a carbon credit, and then they can get there. So we can end up with hundreds of billions of dollars of money flow from big corporations to developing countries. And that's part of the United Nations Article 6 project. And I don't know if you followed much of that, but in Glasgow, there was finally an agreement on Article 6. And then they were working on implementation. So UNFCCC, so that's the climate change group of the United Nations, have been working since the Glasgow conference, 2 years ago. They've been working on the implementation of getting that mechanism to work where countries and big companies are transferring money to developing countries to implement climate action. Okay, so these things can be very big. So the one thing that I would encourage you is to, if you're looking at what can be done, look at what's in the pipeline for money flows and how you can participate in it. So any other questions come to mind?
Yeah, we have a question in the back here.
Hi, Paul. My name is Doreen Kajumba. Thank you for this good presentation. I have a question. All these solutions are very, very great. And my worry would be, how do we convey them to a layman? Why I say that, because I have had a lot of people approach me and say, those things you're telling us are too scientific. They are too much. Yet we want everybody, for example, to take part in climate action, because when climate crisis is hitting, it does not segregate. So in the work you do, how do you plan to talk to other activists or people, encouraging people to take climate action to make the information friendly or understandable to everyone that is affected by climate change? My other question would be, do you and your organization have plans of ever going, say, in North Africa or South or East Africa? I'm from East Africa, so I would really lobby for East Africa, because if you went there and encouraged people to take up like the proposal bit and ABCD, that would mean a lot to me, and like for the North Africa people, they will also. So do you plan to ever set up work in those other parts of Africa or the global South?
Yeah, well, the one thing is, you remember I was telling you about the Africa Climate Action Initiative, which is which is a group I'm part of, and I hope to see this grow considerably.
Yeah.
That we had recently, I had an ambassador from Kenya that was quite interested in this and was hoping to end up with a Kenyan section of the Africa Climate Action Initiative. So we have Kenyans here that are working with Kenyans there on these kind of projects. But then this should happen not just for Kenya, but for multiple countries, that are active, where we have a number of people here that would like to do business back in those countries, okay? And the one thing that I would also encourage you is to look at the business associations between these countries. So for example, there's a Nigerian-Canadian Business Association. Imagine there's a Kenyan Canadian Business Association, because there you're dealing with the business community, and there's a lot of money to be made with implementing climate solutions. Okay, so there could be a huge scale up of collaboration about what can be done. Now, as far as getting people, educated about the opportunity, I was really impressed with what they were doing here. This group that was putting together the music, then they were doing some music videos where they would pull stuff together. Now, what I think that there should be is that if you go to Drawdown Lift, you'll see a lot of information, because you can go to the different climate solutions. And there could be, to me, some short animated videos that illustrate some real key ones that make a lot of sense. And then you make it sort of like, with good music, and you have it so that that people can follow it. And then you end up where these things, become YouTube videos that get shared widely, right? And they're getting that done. So I would do that. And then the other thing, that if you really wanted to get a lot of people motivated, there's these diaspora organizations, right? They have the Nigerian Canadian diaspora, and certainly I would imagine there would be other things like that. And to get them, and then and for me to get them to motivate, you want to show them how they can make money, right? If it's just reading, and because they've got their own bills to pay, they got all this stuff, I would imagine that many people here that are concerned about their home country wouldn't mind to have a project that was profitable, that would actually cover their costs for travel and whenever they needed to do it. So I would think that you want to focus on talking about money. Okay, about how it can be profitable. Now, just to give you an idea of this thing that we worked on, this cactus thing, and when I started looking at the profitability, this blew me away. So we've got a project that's going to be 200 hectares of cactus, okay, and it's going to be making several $1 million a year. Now, if you go to the marginal lands where cactus will grow, so you go to northern Nigeria, you go to Chad, and you go places like that, there are millions and millions of acres. So this is going to be a many billion dollar business, okay, in terms of profitable. I go, what? Why isn't this already huge, right? and when you look at what they can do. So it's already a very large business in Morocco, but it's not a large business in West Africa. Okay, and so this can be substantial. Now it's not only let's say not only cactus, but of course a wide range of things. But the one thing that I would encourage you guys to do is also look at the range of solutions and look at the profitability of it. Because if you've got a good solution that can make you money, then I think you'll be likely more motivated to implement. So next.
We're going to take the last question here in the back.
Okay.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for the great presentation. My name is Daphne, a voice for girls and women. My question is, women are key to building climate resilience in communities. How is your team working with women, for example, in Nigeria, to bring that to cause?
Well, definitely. That's one of the big things that I want with this, with these education servers, that you would have a lot of content about how to become more resilient, because as you can see, that the situation becomes more dire over time in Africa, and there needs to be, I think, a lot more information shared. And the one thing that I would welcome you guys to do is to try out this thing and see how easy it is, and then communicate that with your partner organizations in Africa and say, hey, you guys can do this too. This stuff is all free, and it's something that could be implemented. And what I would like to see is people who are motivated to help their friends in Africa that are computer oriented, to actually follow our step-by-step guide, and you can take an old computer and turn it into the same computer this one is, and it becomes a hotspot. And so that is something that I think would be quite good. So I would like to see that spread quickly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much,
okay.
Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So just like you guys, I learned a lot. I do have a few questions for Paul, but we are going to take our coffee break as well as our networking break. So please feel free to ask whatever questions you did not have the opportunity to ask Paul. There's some refreshments outside, so mingle. Turn to someone at another table, introduce yourself, find out what they do. And when we come back, I will ask everybody to move up. So whoever is coming late is seating behind you. And if we don't move up on our own, then I'm going to have to do a seating, and I don't want to do that. So we are adjourned. So we'll be back in about half an hour. Thank you. Change, and like some of you, like I am learning just as some of you, and I'm not an expert, so we're here to listen to the experts. But before we get to our next speaker, I would like to introduce the Executive Director and the founder of the Center for Social Justice Initiatives, Doreen, to address you. So please give Doreen a round of applause. Don't be shy.
I think my work right now is very simple. First of all, to tell you who I am, why this was very important, and we shall talk again, right? So how I came to incorporate or start the Center for Social Justice Initiatives. As a survivor of gender-based violence, I realized with my fellow survivors that sometimes when we go to technocrats to solve our issues, they may apply things that we don't understand. So I and some other fellow survivors thought, why don't we go peer-led, like, because we understand ourselves and we all know survivors, it takes a very hard, it's a hard decision for someone to confide in you and tell you, but they can tell their fellow survivors. So that was the model. However, right now we are comprehensive. We take all models to support each other. The Conference of Climate Change and Gender came into play when I realized that the impact of the climate crisis is never neutral. It affects everyone. But how many women, for example, sit at the decision-making tables? How many women benefit from the climate fund, the financing? How many women are trained how to adapt? Because the levels at which climate change is right now and the impact, you either need to adapt and become resilient or take action to see how you can change the future, because we have generations to protect. And not that I'm offending men rather, but we all know mothers of a nation or mothers of a home always want to protect. So why don't we come and share our capabilities as women? We don't want to come as a vulnerable gender, but we want to say we have something to contribute to the climate action. Because when, for example, that drought hits, it's a mother who will struggle with the kids, explaining to them we don't have food because, or when the flooding came, it swept away. We all know, that some countries, for example, do not believe women should sit in the boardrooms. But women are being impacted and they need to have their voices heard. So that is why I thought, since climate crisis is not segregative, it affects everyone. However, it affects women more. So we need to join those boardrooms. We need to benefit from the fund. And we need to learn. We need to be taught or empowered to adapt and become resilient. So, and also the other funny bit is, you know, when they think you're educated, like from where I come from, if you have a bachelor's, you're educated. But things like the climate change or the crisis, we look at it as an issue for scientists. But when it is affecting, it does not affect only scientists. It affects all of us. So I took the courage to learn, and through learning, I want us to learn, all of us, you know. So I appreciate some people here. Mr. Wilson Insedeko, I appreciate you so much and enabling me to do this. You introduced me to Mr. Kwame. Mr. Kwame has been a gift to the organization, and he has made me meet a lot of people, a lot of knowledgeable people that we are all going to learn from. And he has spared his time, a lot of time. He's volunteered a lot of time to the organization. And my special speakers, thank you so much for allowing to teach us to speak and to educate, because we have to use all ways to make sure climate action takes place. So enjoy. It's the first day. Yeah, enjoy and learn. Thank you for coming. Yeah, have a great day. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much. Please give her another round of applause. I apologize. I left the bio. How are you guys feeling? Wow? Good? Amazing? Great? Are you cold or are you hot? Cold? Wow. Hot? I don't know. I think in between. Well, I want you guys to be a little lively. Like, we're here for climate change. Let's be excited. If not, then we're all gonna stand up and do exercise. Okay. So our next speaker is Luama Mulalu. She is a second-year PhD student in global health at McMaster University, concentrating on globalization and equity. She has a keen interest in the political economy of knowledge production, decolonial storytelling, problem framing, forms of historic erasure, and how continued social amnesia in the global public consciousness relates to the perpetuation of ongoing grievous systematic injustices on the African continent. What guides her hunger for this collective construction of a new world order is the question of how we can co-create a more valuable and shared future for all based on more truthful storytelling pertaining to the birth narratives of some of our countries, and how some of those socio-political stories and myths we tell intentionally obscure the root causes of structural violence and entrench systemic inequities. Empathy-driven and people-centered work has always been an integral aspect of her holistical work that she aims to immerse herself in. And a favorite quote of hers from Ralph Emerson, who stated, "To know even one life has breath easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded." Today, our lovely speaker will be giving us a talk on the post-colonial mythism in Africa, an autopsy of empires, climate narratives, and the colonial logics that manufacture death and structural violence amongst racialized women. So without further ado, please give a warm round of applause for Luama Mulalu. I'm gonna give you this mic. This one's nice.
Oh, thank you. I get the nice mic. Oh, God. There you go. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Luluama. I'm originally from Botswana. And yep, I'm a second-year PhD student. In a nutshell, what I really look at is problem framing and political stories, and how political stories, especially when they come from the global north, tend to erase a lot of suffering in the global south. And I really do that within the area of the climate crisis. So this talk is really about how do we disrupt climate narratives, especially when they come from empire, and how do we reclaim our own voices and start to tell our own stories. So some themes we will explore today revolve around the unequal impacts and the historical drivers of inequality, the colonialist roots of the climate crisis, passport privileges, and visa access, and how that impacts how knowledge is produced, especially when a lot of conferences are held in the global north. Right? And we know that as an African, it's not very easy to get to these different conversations, and that's the predominant conversation that's been happening right now. We're going to look at the intersections between climate and gender naturally, and sacrifice zones and expanding geographies of violence. So we know that there is no doubt, like I said, because a lot of conferences are situated in the global north, that the politics of knowledge production in the field that I'm in, which is global health, are really rife with neo-colonial conduct and ideologies that really center the European lens or the colonial gaze. If we as a global society are aiming to essentially undo the colonial lens and advocate for the right to life for all people, then we really must be more truthful about how we do research, the practices of research, and really deconstructing whitewashed models of explanation that really honestly work to reproduce power imbalances. And these are power imbalances that continue to, the word I use is gentrify reality or co-opt reality, but really monopolize reality and obscure the pictures of what is actually happening in our shared realities. And when we obscure what's happening and we obscure the suffering, what really happens is that we start to rob innocent people around the world of their humanity and again, their right to life. So currently we do not live in systems that are life-affirming, that protect everybody equally. Instead, we live in what are essentially death-based social, political, and economic systems that are designed to prioritize profit over people and create environmental catastrophes in the process of capital accumulation and unmitigated growth. So when we're looking into a brief lens of the climate crisis on the African continent, it's important to remember that this is not a singular event that's happening, but it's part of these interlinking global crises that we are facing today. And those should not be underestimated as they have been in the last couple of decades. And really what we need is a new political imagination, an innovative imagination, and new social and economic systems that really recognize the histories of injustice that have shaped the current landscape of where we are. And really we saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which was a moment of rupture, or it really highlighted to the world that the systems that we built are not built to support life. And it's important that we start making these connections between history, systemic inequality, disaster, and injustice. Because what we saw during the COVID pandemic, what a lot of people called vaccine apartheid, vaccine colonialism, those unequal distributions of the vaccination really highlighted the inequalities that, that ultimately have shaped the moment that we're in, but also inform how we will then navigate the climate crisis and ecological breakdown. So it really matters how we produce knowledge and how we understand the crimes of empire, especially in the 21st century. Because if we are to actually create a viable future that is not rooted in systems of triaging or manufactured death of racialized bodies, in order, again, to preserve power, capital, white supremacy, and Euro-American dominance in the world systems, then we have to interrogate what is actually going on. So systems of triage or manufactured death is what an academic named Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics. And essentially what necropolitics is the capacity to define who matters and who does not, and who is disposable and who is not. And so this philosophical framework really showcases how we assign different value to different human lives across the globe. And that's really spearheaded by racism, by white supremacy, by just capitalist ideologies that just seek to dominate both people and the environment. So in thinking about how we assign different values to life, this is how we structure our society. And this necropolitical structure really comes from our long histories of inequality, dehumanization, and unaddressed forms of state-sanctioned violence. And so this is just an aerial view of, this is from, I think, National Geographic, but it's such a striking picture because this, I think what people don't see is what we're actually doing to the environment. And it's not just people that are affected, but it's a whole ecosystem because we are part of the ecosystem. I think that sometimes humans think that we're above. Yeah, so as you look at these pictures, the question that I want you to think about is that when we talk about sustainability and adaptation, what exactly are we asking people to adapt to? What kind of situations, right? So really reflect on these images because some of these are from a couple of years ago, but some of them are very recent with the floods in Nigeria and Ghana. So I come to this presentation not as a historian per se, but as a humble witness or observer of the world with a love for history. Because if you don't understand the harms of the past, then you are doomed to repeat them. And so I speak because this particular moment in our collective shared history and memory calls again for more honesty in how we as academics, politicians, and fellow travelers, people walking alongside each other on this journey, how we choose to describe the growing dysfunction around us and who we choose to invite into the process of world building and world making and future building, who we choose to invite into that conversation is not only, is vital for not only our moral and ethical regeneration as a human society, but for the regeneration of the very ecosystem that, again, we are embedded in. So, just to situate, I'm sure we all have a grounded understanding of what the climate crisis is, but I'm just going to give an overarching definition just so that we're on the same page. So this is from the UN's website, and so climate change essentially refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns, and it's important to remember that these shifts can be natural due to many different factors, including, like it says, the sun's activities. But since the 1800s, which was during the Industrial Revolution, human activities have been the main driver of climate change. And this is primarily due to burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and extractive practices in terms of how we accumulate resources. And so human-driven climate change has a particular name, and it's called anthropogenic climate change. So during the 1800s, again, was the Industrial Revolution. And during this time period, we really saw the onset of a hyper-capitalist economic system that really prioritized exploitation of natural resources, of labor, of especially black bodies, extractive practices that were and still are very much environmentally destructive because of how minerals and resources such as oil and gas are mined and appropriated in the first place. And then those are not just the sole harms, they're also harms that come as byproducts after resource extraction, which include environmental pollution, hazardous waste management, overconsumption. So in terms of the basics of climate change and the concept of warming, so burning fossil fuels produces greenhouse gas emissions that essentially act like a blanket wrapped around the earth. And that traps the sun heat and raises temperatures. And there are many greenhouse gases that cause climate change, including carbon dioxide and methane. But I'm not going to go deep into the mechanisms or science of global warming, because that's not my area of expertise. But this is just to say that there are many factors, both natural and human-made, that really drive increases in greenhouse gases. And agriculture, oil and gas projects are really the main sources of especially methane. But in terms of agriculture, it's important to remember that it's more about industrial farming rather than small-scale farms or family farms. So here we can see that over the last 100 years, the Earth has been warming up, and it's been getting much hotter on average. So although climate change is a ubiquitous process, meaning that it's happening in all corners of the world, it doesn't mean that everybody, like Doreen said, is experiencing the same kind of impact and facing the same levels of existential threat. So people are experiencing the climate crisis in diverse ways. So climate crisis is having a disproportionate impact, especially on African communities, and it's affecting food security, worsening conditions, living conditions of millions of people, and pushing people into severe poverty. And it's damaging critical water supplies that are important, especially to the health and hygiene of children and women. And I'm not sure how aware all of you are, but in the Horn of Africa especially, there have been four consecutive failed droughts, and that has pushed 40 million people who are living within that area into acute famine. And women are specifically affected more by lack of water because they spend more hours fetching the water. And so just some quick facts. So Africa only contributes approximately 4% of greenhouse gas emissions. And I said approximately 37 to 40 million people are facing starvation. By 2050, due to ecological breakdown, it's predicted that about 1.2 million people across the continent will be displaced. And what's important to remember about displacement is that most people tend to be displaced internally, which puts a huge burden on the receiving countries because they don't have the financial capacity to sometimes manage their own citizens. So an influx of people puts these countries under immense pressure and really pushes them towards states of insecurity. And so 7 of the 10 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are on the African continent. So the impacts are unequal, and climate change really affects all facets of the human condition. It can affect our health, our, again, ability to grow food because of droughts, housing, safety, general safety, and your ability to work and be secure in that way. And so some of us, and by us I mean Africans, are already more vulnerable to climate impacts, and other people who are living on small island nations, and as well as other historically marginalized groups located in developing countries are really sensitive to changes in the ecosystem, the environment, and the climate. And so inequalities are not just driven and measured solely based on income, but they're determined by various other factors, including gender, age, your country of origin, or citizenship, your ethnicity, etc. So we know that climate change, poverty, and inequality are inextricably linked. And the shifting weather patterns, droughts, flooding, and storms always hit poor and marginalized communities first and worst, because of the unpredictability of their growing seasons. Crop failures and sharp increases in food prices because of inflation. We know this because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Contextualizing emissions in history becomes incredibly important, right? So especially when we're talking about questions around equitable responses, and that's a dominant conversation that's happening right now. And so when you're looking at the map, you can start to see that the top half shows which nations are most responsible for excess emissions, and the bottom shows nations that are most impacted by it. So you start to see it's sort of reversed. And so it behooves us to then be attentive to the colonial dimensions of climate breakdown. Because if we don't pay attention to the climate dimension, the colonial dimensions, then we are completely missing the picture and the point. So when we start to contextualize the cumulative emissions in history, we start to see like a really shocking injustice. You know, Africa, the continent, is paying most for the effects of the climate crisis, and for a crisis that it just did not cause at all. And so there have been a lot of conversations in multilateral spaces, and in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this was actually the first time that all countries around the world signed a principled document on the climate crisis to fight global warming, and laid out the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respectable capabilities. And that's why I show this map, because the people who did not cause it are expected to finance their own adaptation, and they're also expected to cut emissions in the same ways that developing nations have, which is unfair considering during the 1800s, during the industrial period, they got to develop and use as much coal as they wanted. And this is not to say that we as people from developing countries don't have a responsibility. Everybody has a responsibility in terms of figuring out how to act. However, we do not all contribute in the same way because we have not caused harm in the same kind of way. So then the language of climate financing and reparations. So actually two important points about the Paris Agreement was the objective of the agreement was to limit the rise of temperatures, if possible, to 1.5 degrees, but global north countries pushed for 2. And I want you to remember those two numbers because they will be important much later on when we're talking about the impacts of different degrees and essentially what we're being forced to adapt into. So the second thing about the Paris Agreement that's interesting to note is that the language of climate financing and reparations was specifically taken out by Western countries during negotiations. And really what that agreement failed to do was build a real roadmap, a real actionable roadmap that actually determined accurately how we as individual countries actually respond, and how different governments aim to reduce greenhouse gases as promised, but in a more equitable manner, again, because not all countries contributed equally. And so this is just a set of maps that are contextualizing the climate crisis in history. So the language that we use around climate discourses and really human-driven climate change is wrong sometimes because of what I said before. We didn't all participate in the same way. And so sometimes, like in the Paris Agreement, facts are taken out, a lot of pertinent facts are taken out, and it obscures what is actually happening. So it misrepresents reality in a way that is so destructive, as we know, because of the impacts that the climate crisis is having, especially on the African continent. So these maps are super important. If you look at the one with the, is it pink? Oh, it's pink on my laptop, but this one. So if you look at that map, what is important to note is that the global north exceeded its fair share of planetary boundaries in 1939. And if you can see at the bottom, the global south is still, you can't see, but this is green, and this would be the safe zone. And then this is red, which would be the danger. So in 1939, a small group of countries used up a lot of the shared planetary boundaries. So the global north has contributed 92% of emissions and access planetary boundaries, and the global south has only contributed 8%. And so the global north countries, as a collective group have severely overshot the boundaries several times over, which has been driving climate breakdown again since 1939. And this is important, especially around the language of climate financing, because when you have to then reappropriate your funds or divert your funds in terms of your national budget, you have to take it away from somewhere else. And so Moussa Faki, who is the chairman of the African Union Commission, said, quote, "Our countries are already forced to spend between 2 and 5% of their gross domestic product each year to deal with a problem they did not cause. This is one of the most shocking injustices against the continent." Yeah, and you can also see the other picture just shows which countries, like when you say the global north, when you start to break it down into different regions and countries, you can see that the United States is has a 40% responsibility for the climate breakdown. And the United States is particularly interesting because one of their biggest contributors in terms of emissions is actually the military. But every year, within their climate reduction or emission budget negotiations, they always make the military exempt from any sort of emission reduction schemes. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the nexus between climate change and colonialism. And so there are so many different avenues that you can go into in terms of this conversation, but I'm really going to focus on the highlighted ones at some point, which is resource extraction, illicit outflows, and visa privileges and international conferences. And I think I said illegitimate debt and climate funding, but I'm not really going to focus on that. So really one way of thinking that can help us to really understand exactly how different populations around the world are impacted differently and disproportionately is through the concept of climate colonialism, which really highlights, again, the relationship between climate change and colonialism. And this is both colonialism in the past, but also neocolonialism, which are the mechanisms that still govern a lot of political and social and economic systems. So in a nutshell, what climate colonialism is that it's the global north living and operating at the ecological expense of other countries in the global south. And these are parts of the world that house majority of the world's racialized and vulnerable people. And for the first time in history, the IPCC report mentioned the relationship between colonialism and the climate crisis, explicitly stating how colonialism has worsened the effects of climate change, and in particular, the historic and ongoing forms of colonialism, which are, again, rooted in our political, social, and economic systems work to exploit and extract as many resources and as much wealth, have helped to increase and manufacture the vulnerability of specific people and places around the world, predominantly, again, racialized communities, and forcing them into these incredibly sensitive spaces where they're vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And it's really, and I think it's important to highlight the fact that it's really our social systems and the violence that they produce that place the burden of climate change on the world's most vulnerable people. But colonialism is it's full of so many complexities, but really, as we know, it just refers to the practices and systems that acquire control, either full or partial, over a group's territory, labor, resources, and that can include occupation of land, such as what happened in the United States, in Canada, and Palestine as well. And it also includes economic exploitation of land to benefit the group that's colonizing. So connecting climate change to the heinous acts of current and past forms of colonization involves really truly recognizing the impact of and the ongoing impact of historic injustices, and understanding that those injustices are not just relegated to the past, they're not rooted in the past, they don't just stay in the past, but these legacies and ideologies and logics are alive and well and present, and you saw them unfold again during the pandemic, the inequitable distribution of vaccinations. You also saw it during the HIV and AIDS crisis, where a lot of excess death happened on the African continent, specifically South Africa. And now the climate crisis. So these are not really mutually exclusive events that are taking place, but are really part of the same ongoing historic crisis, and that stems from historic erasure, and that leads to forms of, I guess, social amnesia, because the way that we remember the past, especially certain countries, the way that they remember the past is not accurate. So this is a picture of illicit outflows, and it's really about how much money goes in to the African continent versus how much goes outside. So as you can see, the African continent loses about $192 billion each year because of illicit funds. And we actually only get $30 billion back in aid, but the way that the dominant aid narrative is talked about is as if we're gaining so much from Western countries, when really they're benefiting from our exploitation. And you can see here, 36.6 billion is lost as a result of climate change. 1.3 billion is lost in illegal fishing, logging. So this is all to say that developed countries in the global north actually owe a huge ecological debt to the countries in the global south. Again, because their countries are, as you can see from this, are literally built off of the exploitation and the labor of developing countries, including, the ability to pollute as you wish, and also offshore pollution as well. A lot of fast fashion or used clothes are being shipped to the African continent. A lot of e-waste is also shipped to the continent. So I think that it also, again, shows a level of dehumanization from the perspective of a lot of these elites in the global north. They do not have respect for African bodies. And I think it's time we start to demand that. So, multilateral corporations are what is funneling money out of the continent. And there was a study that was done that showed that just 100 multinational corporations are actually responsible for 71% of global industrial emissions. And a large part of these emissions are a direct result of hyper-exploitation of the people and resources in the global south, which really catalyzes a system of unsustainable consumption, toxic waste, and it's always at the cost of African bodies. And it is what is truly expanding geographies of violence, or what are also known as sacrifice zones. And so these are the different processes that essentially manufacture death and produce multiple forms of intersecting suffering within the continent. And this is really what creates the vicious cycles of disaster, vulnerability, and marginalization. So it's the same high-emitting nations that were and are still responsible for immense exploitation, colonizing, and enslaving much of the world for centuries. These are the same ones that are leaving countries at a deficit and denying the real realities of what's going on in terms of the climate crisis. And I think this picture is particularly important because imagine how much the continent loses in terms of these funds, and these are funds that could be used for climate adaptation policies, and so it really robs the continent of defining and dictating its own future and building a system of reliance, because a lot of the predominant conversation around climate financing is the global north giving to the global south, when really the global south could be self-sufficient if all of these systems were a lot more equitable. So it's really disingenuous the way that a lot of the climate discourse is framed right now, because it doesn't take into consideration the historic context that's necessary to understand why is it that specific countries can't fund their own climate adaptation policies, right? So colonialism and its legacies, and some of these legacies, as we know, include white supremacy, have been the biggest drivers of environmental degradation. So given these disparities, many people have argued that true climate justice and a true climate justice movement really cannot exist without racial justice. And yet, some of the mainstream movements often try to erase people of color from climate messaging and climate conversations. So remember I told you about just keep the numbers 1.5 and 2 degrees in your head, because they will become super important. And so this picture really shows with every degree increase what the impact would be. And so right now we're posited is that we're going to surpass 2 degrees. And if you can see here what 2 degrees is, I can't read it because it's so small, but I think I wrote it down. So I bring this picture up so that we can see, understand, and really put into perspective what exactly our global leaders are asking us to adapt to. So instead of mitigating the root causal factors of the climate crisis, it's the language of adaptation that's being pushed, right? And so, like I said, the world currently is on track to warm more than 2 degrees, which is a truly horrific and frightening scenario. And unless there's some sort of radical shift and transformation in how our global economy works, and really trying to phase out the use of fossil fuels and really reining in extractive industries, then we are likely to breach 1.5 by 2017. And that has, the UN warned that by breaching even 1.5 that and still producing emissions in an unmitigated manner, that will send the world into quote unquote uncharted territory. But parts of the world are already living in states of chronic uncertainty. And so here, with each additional degree of warming, will bring worse climate consequences and will exacerbate existing inequalities. And some of the impacts of that, like when you think about your daily life, right? If it's the difference between like 25 degrees and 26 degrees makes zero difference, right? Because that's just your everyday experience. But a degree warming in the climate has devastating impacts. It's not the same way we think about, oh, yesterday was 13 degrees, tomorrow it will be 14. It does not work the same, and it does not have the same kind of impacts. And I really wish I could make it bigger so we could read what it says between 2 and 3. But you can just see it says a prescription for long-term disaster, and you're starting to see that. And some of the impacts of that are coral reefs face almost complete extinction because the oceans are both warming and acidifying. And then we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction and severe biodiversity loss. Melting ice leads to flooding cities, which leads to people having to evacuate and increase migration. Frequent erratic weather means hurricanes are intensifying at a more rapid rate. You saw that in Mozambique. And because human beings are attempt to dominate the environment, so the human to wildlife interfaces are increasing, and that increases the chances of zoonotic diseases such as Ebola. I believe it is a zoonotic disease. And that really, it just, like either way you try to spin it, it just leads to immeasurable human suffering. So this idea that, during the Paris agreements, global leaders were aiming for 1.5 degrees and really pushing for 2, shows that they really don't understand the level of destruction that comes with those kinds of rises in temperature. And again, because the map that we showed, that the people who are producing excess emissions are not the same people that are suffering, and you could see that those countries are also divided again by racial lines. So the level of dehumanization it takes for you to argue for 1.5 and 2 degrees is just shocking to me, because you're advocating and manufacturing, again, death in different, you're sanctioning people to death and robbing people of their futures, all because you want to prioritize capital over people. What we're finally here for. The intersections between climate crisis women and entrenched gender inequality. So I hope that now we can see and understand that what climate colonialism is, which is when, again, richer countries in the global north live and operate at the ecological expense of other countries with lower carbon footprints. And that's how the global north mainly outsources the majority of the burden of risk, and it really offshores the burdens onto former colonies and lower income countries in order to sustain their status quo and hyper-capitalist modes of living. So the Western status quo is manufacturing black and brown deaths in the global south and exacerbating long-standing inequalities that we simply refuse to address. So the global north reaps the wealth and benefits that ultimately drive the climate crisis, and is putting more and more people around the world at a disadvantage because climate change is a threat multiplier. And as we know with any sort of disaster, again, much like COVID, the impacts usually track along gender, race, class, citizenship, and always impacts the most at-risk and historically marginalized groups first, and which are racialized women and girls because of entrenched gender inequality, patriarchy, and just systems of racism. So heat waves and droughts and rising sea levels and extreme storms are disproportionately affecting women and really exacerbating risk and pushing more and more women into systems of violence. And this is because of multiple reasons. Women are more likely to live in poverty than men. They have less access to basic human rights because of the patriarchal systems that we live in. They're less likely to have the ability to move around. So if you're being erected from your land, and usually when people are being erected from their land, they're more susceptible to instances of sexual violence and rape. And systematic violence usually escalates during periods of instability. So there's some little facts there for you. 80% of people are being displaced by climate are women. And we know that, again, women are the ones who have to go and get water, and they have to walk longer distances. So the scarcity of drinking water is forcing women and girls to search further and further and further away, which again increases the risks of sexual violence. And women and girls make up more than 40% of the agricultural labor force and are responsible for 60 to 80% of food production. So we actually need women for our own survival. Mm-hmm. And during again any sort of crisis, women are often the first to go hungry, and so in terms of famine, it's usually women that are impacted the most. And in many areas, child marriage is rising, and children, especially girl children, are really facing some of the greatest threats. Because of deepening inequality and poverty, you're seeing instances of families selling off their girl children because of dowry, and then it's really to survive. And so we're really putting women and girls in super vulnerable situations. And there is a clear link between disaster management, political insecurity, and social economic issues. Disasters and really lack of political will from our global leaders means that the most vulnerable people, again, will always suffer first. And the burden that is put on African women especially is indicative of how normalized the expectation of suffering is, especially amongst Black bodies. And the levels of environmental racism that are in place that really stem from the colonial and imperial logics that govern us today view Black bodies as unworthy of saving. And something that I didn't know before yesterday when I was preparing for this, so I'm from Botswana, and so I didn't know that in Botswana, girls made up 70% of children taken out of school during times of drought. So it has a multifaceted impact. So the global climate crisis is actually a racial justice and gender equality crisis. There cannot be any sort of meaningful solution to the global climate and ecological crisis without addressing systems of racism, and particularly the historic and current racial legacies of colonialism and slavery. And climate justice really looks for historic accountability from nations that are responsible for climate change, and calls for, again, a radical transformation in the way that our systems work. So if you sort of hear the different messages between people who are predominantly located in the global north and African climate activists, the message you hear more is within the African continent is really about systems change, in recognition of the embedded unfairness of how our global systems and structures work. Yeah, and climate change is also leading to migration and is disrupting rural and urban livelihoods and systems of life. And it's forcibly displacing millions of people, again, within countries that simply do not have the economic means and social structures to deal with an influx of people. So for African women specifically, there's a double burden in terms of the impact of climate change because of the intersections between like environmental racism and gender inequality, and is forcing women into more precarious situations. Again, because they don't have any sort of financial or social assets or access to land ownership. So even though women produce most of the food, they actually don't have ownership over land, which is a currency that allows you to build capital. So, and again, these are really a result of the kinds of colonial systems that we still live in. And as a consequence, like you said, women have to work harder to find water. It threatens their economic opportunities and increases household burdens because women are the ones that are present in the house and do a lot of the household labor and are affected through just access to services and lack of decision making. So I'm sad this is not gonna work because I think it's important to actually see with your eyes what's happening. And so there's a part in this video where you see these women who are digging quite deep into a dried riverbed just to get some water, and they form a train. But this is dangerous because the deeper they go, the more likely that the sides of where they're digging will collapse into themselves, and people are dying because they're just trying to get water that way. So I'm sad it didn't work, but that was the main reason I was going to show. And everybody has a right to clean water and just water. So I think it's very ridiculous that we can see the consequences and put blinders on. So I think I have about 20 minutes and I have so many slides left, but that's okay. So as we saw, women, especially African women, are quite vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And because of these reasons, because their proximity to violence, because of their proximity to these colonial systems that really define and shape the world that we're living in, it really matters that they are in the room during climate negotiations, because otherwise, again, you're not making the most accurate connections. You need to be talking to groups that are at risk, because they understand, as they are on the front lines and have the lived experience to describe most accurately what's going on. And thank you. So the Global South, this is Vanessa Nakata said this, so I can't take ownership of these words, but she said, the Global South is on the front lines, but not on the front pages. And she was really commenting about media and media representation, because I think that where we are right now is that if we don't collectively start to tell our own stories, then someone else is gonna tell it for us, and in the worst way possible. So the voices of the Global South have long been put in the back of the line, especially when it comes to conversations around the climate crisis and its impact. So don't mind the thing that says coloniality of power. It's really just what we've been talking about colonial systems that shape inequality, and it really is about systems of power and a Western focus in all of these capitalist projects of exploitation, resource extraction. That's all what that means. So I bring this up in conjunction with the other slide because we just established that it really matters who is in the room when we're having these negotiations. So from all the other slides, we can see that Africans, most especially African women, are the most vulnerable to climate change and already feeling the most impacts. And if that is the case, then the world has a moral and ethical obligation to include our voices. So I'm in the field of global health, and a lot of global health institutions are predominantly located in the global north. And that's where a lot of conferences tend to take place. So a lot of these agencies are located in the US, UK, and Europe. And most global health conferences tend to be held in the global north. And this is important because it really bars people from entering the room and entering the room to tell their own stories. So, so passports and visa privileges that citizens in the global north are privy to are really exacerbating health inequalities around the world because they're leaving out critical voices as they're discussing a lot of these critical issues that impact us all. And so Foucault is a philosopher that really talked about the relationship between knowledge and power. And so what he says is that knowledge and power are inextricably linked, and that knowledge and how we produce knowledge is always an exercise of power. And power, the ability to hold power, is always a function and as a result of knowledge and what kind of knowledge is present in the room, which leads to domination over our shared reality, meaning that every exercise of power, the decisions that these leaders are making, really fundamentally has to do with the knowledge that is present in the room, which is why advocating for more global conferences to be in the global south rather than being in the gates of the global north. So I mentioned Vanessa Nakate a number of times because I'm not sure if you remember, but I think it was about 3 years ago, the Associated Press cut her out of the picture. So they published the top half, and then the full picture was the one at the bottom. Why? And so this is yet another example of how these colonial logics or neo-colonial mechanisms function. Because Vanessa Nakate is a really critical voice leading the African climate movement, and cutting her out of the picture really brought to the forefront how advocates and activists from developing nations are consistently shut out and actively erased from crucial climate conversations and knowledge production and future building. So the failure to acknowledge one of Africa's most prominent female voices in the climate activist space is a major indicator of the way the world continues to ignore the global south and activists that represent those regions. Because the Associated Press didn't just erase one random photo of one random girl. They erased a whole continent's lived experiences, voices, climate reality, and suffering from the entire world's eyes, which is essentially what allows business as usual practices to go on. So by erasing Vanessa, you sanction millions of black and brown people around the world to death and suffering. And there are no solutions without African voices, and climate change is also about reparative justice. And so this is just, you know, as we've seen, who is in the room really matters, and whose voices we listen to during critical global climate conversations is so important. And despite the amounts of research that give warnings that the African continent will be most affected by climate change, even though, again, it contributes the least to global emissions, both currently and historically, the erasure of Vanessa is seen and was seen by a lot of Africans as part of a broader pattern of silencing our voices in climate debates. And this is not the first time that Africans have been shut out of these global knowledge production circles or sites, or whatever you want to call them, these multilateral spaces. But in there was also the HIV and AIDS conference that was held in Montreal earlier in the year, where a lot of Global South activists couldn't get visas to come. And they're the ones who are disproportionately burdened by HIV and AIDS. So this is why where health conferences take place and who is invited to be present in the room when we co-construct our shared reality, and the key word here is shared, is critical, because every year, we say that we're going to do things different, and every single year we continue to fail the very people for whom, you know, we have built my field of global health. And again, the results of this is that, you know, by 2050, again, ecological breakdown is projected to displace 1.2 million people, and 37 million people face starvation in the Horn of Africa. And those numbers are simply disgusting. This was just a video that was going to show all the different climate activists. And I'm happy to share all of this after. And so, really, I think that brings me to the end of the talk. Yeah. I was going to talk about my personal research, but my personal research is, again, I think that I've made it very clear that it matters who is in the room and how we get those people in the room. So my research really interrogates when people are, the kinds of solutions that we've come up with, again, like electric vehicles that don't take into consideration the harms that come with the production lines in terms of coltan mining and all of that are not solutions, because they still sustain inequality, and they still are built on exploitation and the exploitation of black and brown bodies all over the world. So I essentially just, I talk about the post-colonial, because for me, if we were really in the post-colonial, then this wouldn't be happening. So, so I really start to ask questions around, like, when we say post-COVID, post-racial, post-colonial, post-political, what does that actually mean, and who gets to define that space? And to illustrate an example of that, not during, because COVID is still happening, but at the height of COVID, when we saw the inequitable distribution of vaccinations, by the time a majority of Western countries who monopolized the resources and tried to charge lower income countries higher amounts than their counterparts were paying, and also hoarded vaccinations, because I don't know if you saw that at the end, the vaccines that were being hoarded were being, they were getting rid of them. But I bring that up because once the global north or Western countries had a majority of their citizens vaccinated, they started pushing post-COVID living, this return back to normal. And so this was in the same parallel reality where a lot of the global south hadn't gotten even one single dose, including healthcare workers. And majority of people weren't. I think at the time, it was about maybe 4 to 8% of the whole African continent was vaccinated, while different parts of the world had around 70 or 80%, right? And this was not because of vaccine hesitancy, partially because of that, but not in the way that it was described. But it was really about access. People could not access a vital resource during the pandemic. So after that, there was this notion that we were living in the post-COVID era, which is fundamentally wrong, because you can't force, like post-COVID living in the same parallel reality where healthcare workers in the global south haven't even received a single dose. So that's just a little bit about my research. And I am truly grateful for your listening ears. Yeah, I think that my main message is that if we can, let's start to form coalitions, let's use our voices, because I think we can see that the systems that say that they're going to save us won't. And so it is up to us as Africans to demand more from our leaders, but to start using our own voices, that can look differently for different people, including just this conference. When you share the knowledge that you learned here with somebody else, right? That's raising awareness, and that's raising someone's consciousness. So I think that it is up to us to save us. And that starts with how do we come together as people from different countries to come up with resources that can help educate people, and also start to demand more from our leaders. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for our speaker? Okay.
I was just about to leave.
We have one in the front, then we have one in the back here. So I'll go with him and then I'll come to you. Is that okay? All right.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It is really good and interesting. My name is Emmanuel. I would like to ask you 2 questions. One is about the pictures, previous pictures that you showed us.
Yep.
How the people were suffering. One was a man seeing the animals dying, like trying to count, and he's sad. I know that picture, and it was in the country called Somalia, and the place called Somalia bordering Kenya. I think most of us, we know what is happening in that country. So as you and your organization, have you tried to reach out those people to know what is happening there, and what forced those people to go into that situation, and to look the positive side, like where the people are not suffering, and to use those local people to show them that these people are progressing, so you can look at this. So please, why don't you be like this? So if you use local people, at least it can show the picture that you people, why don't you make yourself like these ones? Second question is, I would like you show us the pictures which you say, we have done this, I joined this organization, or my organization and we have tried to reach out these people since we found this area was suffering, and now this is where we have reached. So it can give us a picture that we are interested in your conversation, or what you are telling us, like what you have shared us, so that next time when I come to attend a conference like this, I'm so interested that really I'm interested to join you, because there is a change. Thank you so much.
Yes, I really appreciate your question and comment so much, because I think a lot of the time when we highlight the suffering of African people, it's usually through these really horrific pictures. So I'm very sensitive to that. But I'm also, I guess the intention, because let me first start by saying I'm not part of an organization. I'm a graduate student. I'll talk about the project that I'm starting, which is related to what you're saying. But yeah, just really showing African agency as such an important point, and I take that. And next time I do a presentation, I'll make sure that I have that. And I think because I really wanted to highlight the impacts of colonialism in shaping the climate crisis and not shying away from these images, because often, I think sometimes when we talk, we don't look at the images. So I think maybe all of us in the room have seen the images, but there are other people who haven't. So I think it's important to see in order to understand the level of urgency that's necessary. And in terms of what you're saying about reaching out to different people, for a project that I'm starting is called The Front Lines, and it's meant to be an online magazine that brings in different African climate activists so that they can use their voices and share their own experiences, positive or bad, and really highlighting the action that's taking place. So one of the things that we're building is an activist toolkit to share with different communities around on the African continent, because when you are talking about reaching out to different people and understanding that different parts of the continent are impacted differently. And in the Horn of Africa, there's more of a severity than that I think in, I'll say, in the SADC region, right? And this is not to say that internally, some parts of those countries aren't experiencing massive levels of drought, because that's what is happening in Botswana. But what I found in talking to different climate activists is that if you are in a region that's severely impacted, then you have that awareness. But when I talk to different people in Botswana, because they're not as impacted, there is not as much of an awareness. So the Climate Activist Toolkit is meant to take activists from different parts of the continent to spread climate awareness for different countries, because I think that if you haven't been impacted, you don't understand the severity of what's going on, and that's what I find. So in terms of positive representation, I hope that magazine does that, because it's really about reclamation of our own narratives and telling our stories with using our own words, and highlighting projects that have worked, and people who are doing incredible work despite the circumstances. So I hope that answers your question, but I really take your point to heart about more positive reflections of the continent, because it's always a major frustration for me, especially when you see Western media talking about African bodies. It's from a space of not having agency, which is not something that I ever want to repeat. I don't know if I answered both your questions or just one. Okay.
So we have a question back here.
Thank you so much. I'm really enthused and encouraged with your presentation. Please give the presenter a round of applause. Though it sounded a bit academic, I was just sharing with my colleague here. Yeah, so my name is Tony. I am a gender activist, but a girls' rights campaigner. And you touched a lot of things, environmental racism, the nexus between climate change and colonialism. But I'm just interested in the money part of it. Mm-hmm. You find that, according to my math, is that they take away like 2%, they bring 2% to us, and they take like 90%, because $192 billion is a lot of money, and mm-hmm. there's a lot of, there's little in terms of climate financing. Mm-hmm. I got the opportunity to attend the countries of parties COP, mm-hmm. COP26 in the United Kingdom, that was in 2021. And my country usually comes and makes commitments towards these climate adaptation policies. So now my question was, in your research, was there an opportunity for you to do this kind of follow-ups where is Uganda in terms, okay, where is Uganda? You know, whenever, because every time my country, they send leadership, they come to these countries. For us who are in the civil society, wherever we are home, we make noise, bank tables, you know, you made this kind of commitment. And when you look at that nexus that you're talking about, in terms of natural resources, like women are not anywhere, you know, and they're affected. You talked about agriculture, you gave an example in Nigeria, you know, we saw people, floods and stuff like that. You know, so I don't know if in your presentation you got that opportunity, but I would love to hear more of that with a case study of Nigeria or Uganda. Personally, I got the opportunity to meet Vanessa Nakate in Uganda before I came to Canada. I was in the civil society as an actor. So we used to engage with Parliament in terms of policies. She's a youth activist. And actually that happened during the Economic Forum. That's when it happened, and they cropped out her out of the photo. It was so, and that actually answers one of the things you talked about when it comes to racism. So I have a lot of things to ask, but for now, I would say in your language, the Swana Kila Bonga. I tried to, yeah, so thank you so much. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. To answer your question about financing, I can't pretend to know that I've done a super deep dive into individual countries at all. But what I can comment on is the fact that during a lot of these, you know, COPs and multilateral conversation, the main issue when we talk about climate financing is that we do pledges. And the issue with pledges is that they're non-legally binding. So countries can often make these commitments, these financial commitments, but legally they're not bound to it. They're not bound to it at all, which is probably why you see, you had the pledges with the, you know, we're gonna donate these amounts of vaccines to the Global South, and then when they did the pledges, they was under. And that's the same with, similar with climate financing. Again, I can't comment on individual countries because I'm personally not there with my research. But I can, again, it's the huge issue, and a huge issue that people have been talking about for decades now is that if you're going to make a financial commitment, you should be held accountable for that. But currently there are also no accountability mechanisms. So if someone doesn't, like if a country says I'll donate $100 billion and they only donate 2 million, there's no legal recourse that you could take to force them to give you that money. So I think that the way that we structure those kinds of conversations needs to change so that our leaders and our countries are held accountable for the commitments they make on the global scale, but when they come back home, it's just, you know, going back into their corrupt ways of being. It's just about showing face. So I think that yeah, again, changing the way that we hold these conversations, but also how many people within our countries do know that, oh, my country pledged 100 billion for climate adaptation policies. Because if more people knew, I think more people would try to hold them accountable. So I think maybe that's where we come in as civil society and do our due diligence and educating people and showing them that, oh, actually, and helping people make the connections between both climate colonialism and climate change, and also highlighting that, oh, actually, why you're suffering right now is because your leader made a commitment and then didn't stick to it. Yeah. So I think that's how I would answer your question. Sorry, I don't have more details, but I hope that next time I come, we can have that conversation. Thank you. I think it's time for the break.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Did I scare you? Give our speaker another round of applause, because I learned a lot. You know, I have said this over and over again that just like some of you, I'm here to learn as well. I learned a lot. I even was texting my friend and I'm like, I think we need to do better, because that was very horrifying. I do not want to, I don't want to go out that way. So If you are now joining us, I am your master ceremony moderator for this talk, Sandra and Dean. You guys have done well. Some of you guys look hangry. All right. So we're gonna take a break. We're gonna get some lunch. Then we're gonna come back. So you have 1 hour, please. 1 hour prompt. We're gonna come back, and then we're gonna hear from our next speaker. Thank you. So without further ado, give a warm, full, because you guys are full, round of applause for Katie. Testing.
So first of all, that's a big thank you for you being here. I think that this morning and also with Lulu's presentation, we have a good understanding of the issue and some of the challenges when it comes to how climate change is impacting on women. So hopefully here at the end of the day, we're going to turn to some solutions and you'll walk away feeling hopeful. And also that feeling that this is something that everybody needs to be involved in and that everybody can do something about, no matter how big or how small. So that's the idea when it comes to climate action and climate advocacy. So we're starting with a quote by Dr. Vandana Shiva. Has anybody heard of Dr. Shiva and her work on climate advocacy? Yes, so she's an Indian environmentalist, eco-feminist, organic regenerative agriculture advocate, and she is also a big supporter of women need to really be in charge when it comes to climate solutions. Because the way that women lead is in terms of forming networks, leading from the side and from behind, and women have the solutions and now need the resources. So we're no longer debating about, okay, what are we going to do? Women are telling us this is what we need to do, and we want to work together with everybody to be able to move these solutions forward. So she says we are either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we're not going to have a human future at all. You've seen some graphs and maps today already. This is just to give you some context of where we have been and where we are now. So you can see since 2,000 years ago, things have been going at a certain rate and then they suddenly jumped. So you get a sense that something changed in terms of human activity in the last 200 years. And I think Lulu explained very well what's happened during that time is the issue of industrialization and the burning of fossil fuels. So this is when you look at where our emissions coming from, that's going to be a big contributor to the emissions in the atmosphere right now, which is causing our global warming issue and our climate change issue. That's impacting on so many different areas: food security, human security, migration, and the rest, and gender equality. And you can see the way that this manifests is just in terms of a steady climb in terms of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So when we're talking about climate change, it's about really balance. And right now we're out of balance. And this is just another one to say there are natural fluxes, but you can see, the last little bit, it's been going up and it's not coming back down. But what you can see is this is the issue in the last couple of 100 years. And up until recently, one of the major sources of carbon emissions has actually been from farming, so the way that we do farming. And that's what we talk about at Landcore, is that only in 1960, in the 1960s, did the emissions from fossil fuel actually pass the emissions that were coming from soil cultivation, so the way that we're cultivating the land. Again, as you were saying too, this is coming from industrial farming for the most part. So you have, and this is with the Industrial Revolution as well, that industrialized our industries. It also industrialized the industry of agriculture. And so this is something that has been kind of ongoing in the background and then has just been surpassed by fossil fuels. So this is just to give you an idea of where we're at now. Of course, we can't just look at graphs to understand this issue. We have to look at photos. So what are people dealing with around the world? People are dealing with the impacts of climate change a lot in terms of water. So it's really cyclical droughts and flooding issues. And then also, not to mention the wildfire issues that we're having here in Canada, and that we have support coming from around the world now to help us here in Canada respond to these wildfires. So it's just to take a step back again and put this in more context. When we talk about the issue of climate change and global warming, this is about the increasing temperature that's heading towards 1.5 degrees and also up to 2 degrees. And Lulu has explained for you what the risks and the impacts on our society will be at that point. But we're dealing with a lot of different kinds of processes that the Earth is going through, especially because of the impacts of human activity. And another one of those which is connected with climate change, but is not totally caused by climate change, is desertification. And this really has to do with land use change. And so this is interconnected with climate, but there are two kind of processes that are going on at the same time. So here's where climate change fits. You can see this is one of 9 of what the Stockholm Resilience Center calls planetary boundaries. So they came up with this framework of planetary boundaries to say, okay, this is really about a balance thing. We have a safe limit on all these different boundaries that we should be aiming to work within and to set up our societies to be able to stay within the green area of those boundaries. So climate change is one. You can see land system change is another. Freshwater change as well. Biosphere integrity, ocean acidification, and the list goes on. And at the point when it crosses over this line right here, you can see that we're in an overshoot stage. So this is an unsustainable place to be in. So when we look at those boundaries that have already been passed, they all feed into each other, right? So the impacts are going to be multiplying and feeding off of each other. But the thing is, when they're in the green operating area, climate sustainability, sustainable means of farming, is also going to help us deal with the desertification issue. So it really gives us a sense that this is a human management challenge. And humans have caused this issue, and certain humans, right, and other people are now dealing with the impacts of it, and now we need to be able to change our management strategy. So here's a quote that just gives you a sense of how humans interact with and manage land causing desertification and climate issues. So sometimes we think of drought causing bare ground, and we think drought is this thing that's coming down on us because of climate, but we can also cause bare ground and then therefore droughts after that if we leave the land bare. And so this is something it's kind of a mindset shift, but it also gives you an idea that we have the power to unmake this thing, and we have to, right? In the last, I think, under 100 years, a third of farmable land has been lost, so this is due to soil erosion. Soil erosion is a huge problem when it comes to food production and food security, and we have to be able to reverse this challenge. So when it comes to also climate change, so just to zoom back in there, if we were to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, this is going to be great, but because the concentration has already gone up in the atmosphere, what that's going to do is stop it from going up more. But what we still have to do is to bring it back down. And so what this researcher here, Susan Solomon, has said is that, okay, if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, that's going to be good, but we are still going to be dealing with the impacts of warming and also ocean thermal expansion for 1,000 years until it would naturally come back down on its own. And I think that we know that we want to be able to speed that up because we would have heard, what's coming, not in thousands of years, but in 5 years, 10 years, a few decades. So this is, when you see the word irreversible, that makes you kind of want to say, okay, well, what's the point? What can we do? But I think that in that case, we have to look at this word here, which is except. So unless. So this would be for 1,000 years, unless, right? So irreversible on a multi-century to millennial timescale, except in the case of a large net removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over a sustained period. So this is a quote from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is like the group of scientists that gets together and they look at all the research and they tell us, okay, what's going on when it comes to climate and what do we need to do? And they've said, okay, we can actually, this is going to be how it is if we don't do something. If we actually do something, then we can reverse this issue. And they would have identified, okay, where are we going to put the carbon dioxide? Soil carbon sequestration has the greatest potential for reducing emissions at the lowest cost. And the potential for land to hold carbon and act as a sink for greenhouse gases is unparalleled. So this is what the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification has said. So this is a thing about balance. There's too much going up and there's not enough coming back down. And part of that is the way we manage our land. So we know we can store more carbon in the ground, but we're not really managing land. So that's public land and private farming land and forests that way. But if we do change our management, we could actually be able to regenerate the earth. So this is a management issue. So we're going to use the same tools differently to be able to restore climate stability. So a lot of times people talk about cows, for example. Okay, part of the emissions are coming from cattle. But what people don't necessarily talk about is there's different ways to manage cattle, right? If you look at an industrial livestock production system, of course that's emitting a lot. But that's also, anybody who's a pastoralist or a grazer who works on land is going to tell you that's not the way that we should be raising cattle. So it's a management approach issue. So we can use the same tools that would have been contributing to this problem to actually start to reverse it. And when we're talking about the word regeneration, I think a lot of times now in the climate change movement and tables, you hear the word of sustainability. But when you look at this, where we are now is here. So we've actually, when it comes to land management, we've actually degenerated to such a point where a third of land, farmland, is not farmable because it's so degraded. And you need that healthy soil to be able to grow productive plants and animals and then to feed human beings in it. So we've actually come down to this point from overuse of fertilizers, from really intensive kind of farming systems. And these are farming systems that predominate in North America. Right, so in Canada and the United States. And those kind of farming systems have also been exported around the world. So when people are practicing small, organic, diversified farming systems that actually still produce the majority of the food that feeds the world, they're not working in the same kind of way that a big, large-scale industrial system that's using a ton of fertilizer, tilling the soil very heavily, is working. But those systems have been exported around the world, and now people are trying to be able to resist them and resist the degradation that would come with them. So when we're talking about sustainability, we have to get to this point back up here before we can sustain that, because sustaining is just maintaining the state of the natural resources for future generations to be able to use. But we still have some work to do to improve on the state of the natural resource base before we can look at sustainability. So that's why we're talking about regeneration. And we're looking at soon some examples of women leaders who are leading in the regenerative movement around the world when it comes to land management, farming in such a way that really builds soil health. So soil health is the base of regeneration. because you can use management strategies to bring life back into the soil, and you can actually bring degraded land back from that. You can actually bring land that's almost in a desert state back to covered in green, productive, and doing it in a state where it's actually drawing carbon out of the air and storing it in the soil. So I think that the mindset shift that we have to be able to have is that we actually can have a very positive interaction with the environment. I think now at this point, a lot of people are thinking, okay, you know, human beings must have done something really wrong here, and maybe we should just, you know, sit this one out. But really, we have a very large area of potentially positive influence on land, depending on the management strategy. So this is just to say, this is an important area also because the food and agriculture system, not only in production, but also in terms of all the other steps in the food supply chain, so packaging, transportation, distribution, in this globalized food supply chain that we have, each one of those steps has some emissions attached to it. So when we talk about reducing climate impacts from the food sector, it is largely in the production stage. That's where you can actually be carbon negative by drawing carbon back down into the ground. But we have to look at the whole food production chain. And some estimates, I think most estimates will tell you that the food system is responsible for 1/3 of emissions. And some others will even go further than that and say, if you factor everything in, it could be half. And so we're saying, yes, burning of fossil fuels is where a lot of emissions come from. A lot of those fossil fuels are used for the purpose of transporting food, right? For heavy processed food. And so this is really an important area to focus on when it comes to not only reducing the climate issue, but also reversing it. So just to give you an idea of an example that we have here in the States, or down there in the States rather, is Kansas. So one of the states in the United States, 90% agriculture in land volume, but imports 90% of its food. So if you can imagine, you would grow something on your farm and you can't really even sell it across the road. So it's a global food system we're living in, so they will be exporting that somewhere else. And at the same time dealing with hunger and food security issues. And this is a kind of system that is mirrored in different parts of the world, is very focused on export and trade, and we're producing this food and dealing with hunger issues, and where's the food going? It's going somewhere else. Or growing food that would go into processed food, rather than growing actual healthy food that we would be able to eat. So a lot of times you hear this quote of, oh, okay, well, we're trying to feed the world, so that's what America will say. This is not true. America is struggling to feed itself because of this food system. So we really need to look at a different kind of way of producing food that will contribute to food security and then also climate resilience. So when we talk about emissions, so this is the different sources of emissions and then also sinks. So sink would be like where emissions would go into and get stored. So from human activity, these are in gigatons of carbon. So that's like 1 million tons of carbon. So 8.9, and this is a bit old, so it's probably going to be a bit higher than that. Annually from human activity, where are all the places that it goes? Some is absorbed in the ocean. And as Lulu was saying, that can cause some challenges when it goes in there, like acidification, and then that's going to harm coral reefs and so on, and ocean life. It goes in the atmosphere, where it's contributing to warming. And then the other one is in terrestrial sinks, so in land. And in land, it's actually where we want it to be, since carbon is actually the building block of life and of plant growth. So if we have carbon in the ground, we're going to be feeding plants with that and creating more nutrient-dense food, while at the same time dealing with our climate issue. So when we're talking about balance, it's really about how do we first reduce this bit, and then also how do we direct more carbon into the land sink, where it can actually be able to contribute to food security for us. And this is just to remember carbon is a cycle. It's really a cycle. So we're emitting in one place, we have to look at sending it back down in another place, and working more so with the natural cycles of life rather than against them, as some of our industries are commonly set up to do. How does this all happen? It's through the magic of photosynthesis. So we can try to come up with these technologies that are increasingly complex to try and deal with these issues. And as it turns out, the natural world has already spent billions of years perfecting this technology of photosynthesis, right? And that is, as it was said before, the lowest cost way to capture carbon, while at the same time feeding people. And we already know how to do that. So we have the solutions, we have to implement them. So it's not only going from a net carbon loss to a net carbon gain, but also in terms of water. So as I said, one of the main ways that people feel the impacts of climate change is in terms of water. So with drought, flood, irregular rain patterns, and that sort of thing. But soil is really the regulator of the water cycle as well. And through management strategies, I think we should get to them here. Through management strategies, you can be able to influence your microclimate. So these are some of the principles of regenerative agriculture or soil health focused farming. Least disturbance, so that would be like not tilling the soil as much, because when you avoid tilling the soil, you're going to allow the microorganisms and whole ecosystem of life that's underground to be able to stay intact. Whereas if you till heavy tillage every year, which in some farming systems people would do just to refresh the soil, it's like as if somebody were, if you imagine we're all microorganisms in the soil, it's like if somebody came through here with a massive machine and just kind of shook us all up. And then we would have to spend a week, or at least a couple of hours putting ourselves all back together. So that's like tillage, the impacts of tillage on soil. So that's number one. Number two is a huge one, is keeping a living root in the ground all year round, because the root is what holds aggregate stability in the soil. The third would be armor, so keeping it covered with green plants. Fourth is animal integration, because really managing animals in such a way where you're benefiting from their manure, organic fertilizer coming in, and they're coming to eat off the dead matter off the top of the plants, and that's encouraging new plant growth. This is really something that contributes to building healthy soil, and even faster. And then also focusing on biodiversity and a diversified system, so growing a lot of different crops that can all feed something different into the soil in terms of nutrients, and you're going to end up with a much more resilient system. And then the last one is just context. So understanding, okay, if we talk to a farmer and they say they're dealing with something totally different in their own context or landscape than somebody else is somewhere else, the idea is that these are principles. And after you implement practices, by that point, you will have taken into account the context. So this can work anywhere. These principles can be implemented anywhere in the world and be able to work, so long as you take into account the context. And so by implementing these principles, one of the benefits that comes up, maybe we'll go here, is in terms of water retention and infiltration. So if you see this picture on the right, this is same type of soil. The one on the left has not been tilled for 20 years. They're in the same crop rotation and has not had fertilizer applied. And the one on the right has been tilled every year and had fertilizer applied every fall. And you can see how much the one on the left is holding its form, and it acts like a water filter. And so when it rains, it holds all the water in it, right? And when it's a drought, it's still retaining that water. So one of the ways that soil health builds is in terms of organic matter. So there's a statistic of every 1% increase in soil organic matter holds an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre. So when we're talking about drought resilience, if you can follow these principles, you're going to have more water. So when we look at in the United States, they're dealing with a 1,200-year drought, so a historic drought in the southwest area. Farmers that are working with 4 millimeters of rain a year are still having profitable and sustainable farming systems because of retaining so much water in the ground. And this is a system that people are using around the world in order to be able to mitigate drought. While at the same time they're providing co-benefits to the rest of society in terms of sequestering carbon in the soil. So people are doing this on their own and really are providing us with a public service almost, and need to be more recognized for that. So those are, water is one of the big benefits, is regulating your microclimate. And so you can see when you go to a field that's covered in, say, a cover crop in the wintertime, it will actually be cooler than the field next door that doesn't have plants on it. So if everybody is regulating their microclimate, that can start to add up to changing the macroclimate, which is what we need to do. It also helps with food production and yield boosting because you're making your soil more productive and resilient, and then so that helps with yield and also yield stability between years. Economic capacity, species diversification, community resiliency and conflict resolution, and the rest. So what's the potential of this? People give different estimates because it's a hard thing to measure, especially because it's a cycle and it's always changing. So I'm just giving you one of the more optimistic ones. You know, I think sometimes people say, okay, we want to be cautious, we don't want to be overly optimistic. But this is a study that looked at a bunch of other studies that had been done and said, looking at all these, if we shifted both crop and pasture management across the world on our global farmlands and pasture and rangelands to regenerative systems, that could draw down more than 100% of annual carbon dioxide emissions, while at the same time increasing food production and resilience. So this is something that this is possible at the same time as we're dealing with our other sources of emission from fossil fuels and so on and so forth. So some people say that's too optimistic, but the point is that we're so far away from our total land area around the world being managed regeneratively that there's really no point in not trying, because it will be a while before we get up to 100% and we would even be able to see if this is true. So I think the estimates are now that 5% of land is being managed regeneratively globally. So it's like, okay, even if we have, say 50%, that's going to be 10 times more than it is today. So that's a huge boost. So it's not really a question of, you know, debating over what the potential is. It's more about how do we increase this, because we know it's a good thing. That helps us deal with other issues. So it's almost like we need to do the impossible. So we're talking about going from 5% up from there. So this is really about management approach, and so this means that there's also a mindset shift that has to happen and that can happen. So here's an example from this thing called the Community Consensus Institute. So they say, okay, this collaborative land management requires people to be able to change their mindset and also to be able to cooperate. So the example is from the 1990s in Mali in the Inner Niger Delta. So there's 7 communities around that were facing 85% food insecurity. And also intercommunal conflict issues because of that. And so the Community Consensus Institute came to sit down and say, okay, do you think that you could increase food production here by 10%? And they said, yes, we have to. And then what about 20%? And they said, oh, this sounds like a lot, you know. And then what about 50%? They said, definitely not. And so the next question that would follow is, why is it impossible? And lots of reasons given, like lack of capital to invest in the farming system. The soil is poor. It can't be done without fertilizers. There's not enough rain, and so on and so forth. So after that question, the next question is, okay, so given that it's impossible, if it were possible, then what would you do? And then people had all kinds of ideas. Well, we would do rotational grazing, accumulate manure on the land. We would plant leguminous trees, build contour barriers, allow the land to recover, intercrop species, diversify crops and polycultures. So then people are like, okay, we're going to try this and see what happens. And then 15 months later, food production increased by 78%. So just in a period of under 2 years. And once people were able to see that, okay, this is possible, then they reframe their goal. Okay, so we're going to go for more. So this is kind of a process that I think that we would all need to go through, especially people involved in land management, because those are farmers and ranchers are actually the people who are making direct decisions about the way that land is managed. But it's not just those people, it's everybody who's involved in climate change in one way or another. So whether that's advocacy, whether that's at the community level, whether that's at the national level, or even beyond, we have to have this mindset of, okay, so we have a lot to do in a short time. That's how it seems like. So we just need to look at, okay, we know it's impossible, but if it were possible, then what would we do? And then we're going to try that and see when it's working, we're going to reframe our goals. So this is just another example of the mindset shift. This is in Zimbabwe, I believe, or in South Africa. So 8 inches of rainfall per year. And this system on the right is using holistically managed ranching. And so when it rains, they keep all the water. And the one on the left is still dealing with drought issues because of the management system. So this is about the most important thing you can do in terms of your food choices is looking at the production system that it was grown in. So it's almost matters less what the food item is and more, how does the ecosystem look that it was grown in? Is this piece of food regenerating an ecosystem in its production or degenerating one? And that's the choice that you can make. Another example of how quickly things can happen when we reframe, okay, given that it's impossible, what are we going to do? When we talk about topsoil loss, natural reformation of topsoil can take up to 1,000 years because it's a very slow process of, rocks breaking down and turning into soil. With farmer management, using the principles that we just went over, so, increasing the cover on the soil, living root, animal integration, you can see topsoil formation happen within 1 year and huge impacts happening within 3 years. So this is really a sign that human beings can have such a positive impact. So those are some of the key things that we're talking about when we talk about regeneration. And it's a global movement, and it's being led really by men and women. But today we want to show some examples of women who are leading in this movement. So here's Dr. Vandana Shiva, scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate, ecofeminist, and anti-globalization author. So she's from India, but she came to school here in the States, and she was studying, I think, physics or something like that. But then she went back home, and during her trip back home in between semesters, she came across the Chipko movement. So the Chipko movement is a movement of women in the 1970s, I believe, who were attaching themselves to trees to stop logging from happening. So it was women who were just physically putting themselves in front of trees and saying, if you want to take our trees, you have to take us first. And they stopped a ton of logging from happening. And Vandana Shiva looked at this and said, okay, I learned in physics that everything's connected, and this is what I need to dedicate my life to, is really working with women around the world to be able to conserve and protect and restore the environment. One of the ways that she focuses on that is in terms of seed saving. So she started an organization, Navdanya International. It means 9 seeds, so saving native seeds. Just to say that the seed is where the whole agricultural production process begins. And if you want to have an organic, diversified system with a lot of different types of crops, you have to be able to have control over seeds. And control over seeds by corporations is something that's come up in the last 40, 50 years, is companies trying to come and say, genetically modified seed, and we are going to patent this. And we have the right, we control and own this seed. And then they're going to turn it around and sell it to farmers. And she's saying, how can you put a patent on life? And so she's encouraging people to be able to take back the control over seeds and be able to have seed freedom and the freedom to invest in their farming system the way that they want to, which would be in terms of organic, eco-focused agriculture. We have an example from here in Canada. So this is in the Northwest Territories. Her name is Jackie Milne. She runs something called the Northern Farm Training Institute. So she is an Indigenous woman, and she works with Indigenous people, especially youth across the north, where also they're facing food insecurity issues because of lack of proximity and access to the food production system and the harsh climate. So it's hard to produce up there in the north, and food ends up being super expensive because of the transportation it has to get up there. So she's just working with people, training them on locally adapted agriculture. So what are we going to work with up here? They're working with bison. They're working with a lot of different animals and different types of crops that are suited to the northern climate. And also looking at regenerative production systems to be able to have food sovereignty and resilience. So sovereignty over your own food production system. So if we have like a supply chain breakdown like we had in the pandemic, then it would be much better to have access to local food. And so that's what she's doing up there with the Northern Farm Training Institute. And what she talks about is there's 3 legs of the regenerative stool. You can look at it. Of course, you have the ecological one, so you're providing ecological benefit. And there's the economic one, so when you're making your land more productive, you can get a better return off that. But she says we can't forget about the 3rd one, which is the personal health, well-being, and spirituality one. So if you're not, if you're an organic farmer, you're producing wonderful, high-quality vegetables, you're making a return, but you're working way too hard, you're not focusing on yourself, and then you experience a burnout. You haven't had a fully regenerative process. And so she puts a huge focus on training in terms of personal well-being and personal regeneration as part of the whole holistic process to management. And then the 3rd example would be Precious Fury, who is the Africa Director for Regeneration International. She's in Zimbabwe. She's training people on holistic management and also holistic planned grazing. So that would be like this regenerative kind of management of cattle. So also in dealing with the drought issue, people have been able to extend the growing season from 2 months to 7 months by using this management strategies. So this is like the difference between food insecurity and food security, is learning to use these strategies. And also looking at healthy soil and restored food and water security for people, livestock, and then also for wildlife. So one of the big benefits we haven't talked about much is in terms of biodiversity. A lot of times when you look at a regeneratively managed ranch and you might have like a national park beside that, the wildlife are actually on the regenerative ranch because it's a more biodiverse environment for them to be in. The birds are all on the regenerative ranch. And you will think, okay, we have these conservation areas. That's for wildlife. But the wildlife are going to self-select, and they're not going to respect the fence line or the border or whatever it is between these 2 things. They're going to go where the land is healthier. And so you can really see that restoring and focusing on healthy soil is something that's positive for wildlife as well. And they're going to be able to show you that. So people also measure the health of their land in terms of how many birds are here, how many insects are here. So those are real indicators.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. So let's give Katie a round of applause. That was very informative. So we made it to the end, guys. We pulled through. Give yourselves a round of applause. And if you were late, I would like to reintroduce myself. My name is Sandra Aneen. I am the moderator for the first international conference on climate change and gender. Today is our day 1. Tomorrow will be our day 2. It starts at 10 a.m. So don't be late so you can get all your questions in. And as we conclude today, please feel free to speak to Katie, Lulu, Paul, they're here. I also like to thank the three of you for speaking and educating us, and also showing or giving us insight on your views, as well as, facts, the proof to what you guys spoke of. So let's give them a round of applause again. And as well, let's give a round of applause to the Center for Social Justice Initiatives for putting together such a well-rounded event. So, DJ, you can show your skills. We are closed for the day.